inflection points and moments in the past. And my hope is that this is something that is really going to continue and something that provokes discussion, conversation, hard work in this denomination. And I'm here representing the National Archives of the Presbyterian Church USA, but also in our larger communities, because these are issues and things that I think resonate very widely at this point. And one very important piece of this, I believe, is Dr. Yu's book. It is so powerfully based in history, and at this moment in our society and culture, I think having that really well-researched background of history that people can share and relate to and frame their thoughts and discussion is so important. I also like that this book shows how libraries and archives are really important at this moment. Without that preservation of those sources, without making sure they are accessible, you do not get all of the evidence that Dr. Yu presents to us in this book, right? And so with that, as I hope a kind of more common base and framework as we move forward on this work, and it's not going to be easy, and I think we all know that, but I am hoping that this is not just another important point that then other things happen and other things take priority. This is so crucial right now. And that is really one of the reasons we wanted to collaborate on this book talk and help Dr. Yu get the word out, right? There are conversations already happening in this country and in this denomination, and I think they need to continue. So it is my privilege to officially introduce Reverend Dr. William Yu. As most of you know, he is the Associate Professor of American Religious and Cultural History here at Columbia Theological Seminary. He also directs the MDiv program here. He earned his own MDiv from Westminster Theological Seminary in 2004 and his PhD from Emory University in 2014. In addition to his new book, he is also the author of the book American Missionaries, Korean Protestants, and the Changing Shape of World Christianity, which was published by Routledge in 2017, and also The Presbyterian Experience in the United States, a source book, published by Westminster John Knox Press, also in 2017. And the new book, What Kind of Christianity, is also published by Westminster John Knox Press, which is an official publishing arm of the Presbyterian Church USA. I also want to, at this point, introduce Reverend Dr. Persavia Prelo, who's going to do a facilitated question and answer, and then also take questions from the audience after William's presentation. Dr. Prelo is the senior pastor at 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., and she's also the director of contextual theology at Howard University's School of Divinity. Dr. Prelo earned her PhD in American history from the University of Illinois in 2012, and her MDiv right here at Columbia Theological Seminary in 2016. Before accepting her current calls, she pastored several Presbyterian churches and also taught history at Benedict College, Augusta University, and Bowie State University. So she has been so adeptly balancing these two things that are so important in her life, and she continues to do that. And what a kind of, wow, I've lost the word. What a good thing that is for our denomination, is to combine that history and the knowledge of theology and pastoral skills. The Presbyterian Historical Society has hosted both Dr. Yu and Dr. Prelo on multiple research trips, and we are located in Philadelphia, for those of you who don't know. And they both have served on the Presbyterian Historical Society Board of Directors. So I think they are just two people that embody connections between PHS and Columbia Theological Seminary. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Yu, who will begin by speaking about his new book, What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Presbyterian Church.
Katie Geneva Cannon, a womanist theologian and the first Black American woman to be ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1974, once asked, "Where was the church and the Christian believers when Black women and Black men, Black boys and Black girls were being raped, sexually abused, lynched, assassinated, castrated, and physically oppressed? What kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to Blacks, these same rights which had been given to others without question?" In 1836, approximately 250 commissioners from across the northern and southern states gathered in Pittsburgh for the annual meeting of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, PCUSA hereafter, the largest Presbyterian denomination in the nation, with over 2,800 congregations and nearly 220,000 members. One of the matters these Presbyterians would grapple with was their church's position on the enslavement of more than 2 million Black persons. It would neither be the first nor the last time Presbyterians at a General Assembly meeting would engage slavery. But this particular occasion presented one of the clearest opportunities for the denomination to answer important questions about where the PCUSA stood on slavery and what kind of Christianity it would profess and practice. On May 19th, the meeting began at 11 o'clock in the morning with a worship service. William W. Phillips, a white pastor of First Presbyterian in New York City and moderator of the previous year's General Assembly, preached from Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, a text emphasizing that Christians must not be ashamed of the gospel and imploring the just to live by faith. Yet some Presbyterians were in fact deeply ashamed of their denomination's reluctance to participate in movements for the emancipation of enslaved persons. In 1835, the Chillicothe Presbytery in Ohio sent a letter to other presbyteries beseeching them to adopt its resolutions on slavery. The members of the Chillicothe Presbytery were aware that some of their fellow Presbyterians, even in northern states that had abolished slavery, either demurred on or outright declined to address slavery because they understood it as a political matter outside the spiritual jurisdiction of their church. In response, the Chillicothe Presbytery found Black enslavement to be, in their words, a heinous sin and scandal, demanding action from all Presbyterians because their church's purity and prosperity was at stake. One of this presbytery's most controversial recommendations was more stringent disciplinary measures against slave-owning members, such as suspension from the Lord's Supper, a significant sacrament within the Presbyterian tradition. Although the General Assembly in 1818 declared that slavery was a gross violation of human rights and, quote, totally irreconcilable with the spirit and principles of the gospel of Christ, end quote, the exhortation to exercise forbearance toward enslavers in the same resolution resulted in no concrete actions toward Black liberation and produced the kind of Christianity that the Chillicothe Presbytery could no longer tolerate. But the commissioners in 1836 ultimately decided that the question of slavery, quote, be indefinitely postponed, end quote, for 3 reasons. 1, an interpretation of the Constitution of the PCUSA that prevented the construction of ecclesial laws binding the individual conscience. 2, the urgency of other remaining business. 3, the, quote, shortness of time, end quote, permitting to, again, quote, deliberately and decide judiciously on the subject of slavery, end quote, even though the duration of the meeting was 2.5 weeks. Not days, but weeks. Where was the Presbyterian Church when over 2 million enslaved black persons were being abused, raped, and oppressed? In 1836, 2 weeks after his sermon, exhorting fellow Presbyterians to practice their faith as unashamed ambassadors of the gospel, William W. Phillips voted in favor of an indefinite postponement of any discussion and decision regarding slavery. One of the commissioners from the Chillicothe Presbytery, John Rankin, voted in opposition to the indefinite postponement. Rankin was a white pastor of a Presbyterian congregation in Ripley, Ohio, and 2 months after his vote, he accepted a position to serve as an agent of the American Anti-Slavery Society, an abolitionist organization founded in 1833 that advocated for the immediate emancipation of enslaved persons. One of its founders, William Lloyd Garrison, observed in 1832 that white Christians in the United States were guilty of racial prejudice against black persons in their discriminatory attitudes and actions toward free black Americans and their participation in black enslavement. Garrison believed white congregations and denominations like the PCUSA required a purification, quote, as by fire, end quote, because of their resistance to the cause of immediate abolition, their reluctance to denounce enslavers within their ecclesial bodies, and their positioning of the, quote, sanctity of religion, end quote, as a mantle to obscure the sin of slavery. In 1824 and 1825, Rankin published a series of 21 abolitionist letters in a local newspaper. Rankin's immediate audience was his brother, Thomas Rankin, who had purchased enslaved persons in Virginia. But Rankin desired to publish his letters in a broader effort to present his arguments against both slavery and anti-black racism. Rankin asked his brother and all white Americans to confront the dehumanizing and oppressive evils of slavery. Rankin's understanding of Christianity entailed a God who created all human beings as equal, such that persons of African descent were not naturally or providentially inferior to persons of European descent, as some white Presbyterians and other Christians believed. And Rankin called for an honest accounting of the physical abuse, sexual violence, spiritual oppression, and family separation that enslaved persons experience. Rankin also addressed how black enslavement was destroying the moral integrity of white persons for the ways it permitted, if not promoted, the depravity of enslavers and their cruel treatment of enslaved persons. One of the many criticisms Rankin detailed was the sinful reality that, quote, every slaveholder has power to strip his female slaves, and thousands of them are base enough to put such power into exercise, end quote. A commissioner from the Hopewell Presbytery in Georgia, Eugenius A. Nisbet, also voted in opposition to the indefinite postponement, but for different reasons from Rankin's. Nisbet was a white ruling elder with significant influence in his state's legislature and jurisprudence as a politician, lawyer, and judge. In 1836, Nisbet's career was on the rise as a state senator who was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives 3 years later and the Supreme Court of Georgia in 1845. Although Nisbet likely agreed with Rankin that the indefinite postponement of any action on slavery lacked clarity and courage, Nisbet desired for their denomination to adopt a stronger position with an unequivocal defense of black enslavement and a firm rebuke of the abolitionists within and beyond the PCUSA. 2 months before the General Assembly meeting, Nisbet's presbytery gathered to prepare for the forthcoming deliberations on slavery in Pittsburgh. The presbytery designated its own committee to construct a report with, quote, instructions to commissioners to General Assembly, end quote. The members of the Hopewell Presbytery maintained that, quote, no instance can be produced of an otherwise orderly Christian being reproved, much less excommunicated from the church for the single act of holding domestic slaves, from the days of Abraham down to the date of the modern abolitionists, end quote. The presbytery also the ecclesial authority to interfere with the political institution of slavery, and that any such interference, including changes to Presbyterian polity, would be interpreted as, quote, tyrannical and odious. As a commissioner, Nisbet was encouraged to, quote, use all Christian means to prevent the discussion of domestic slavery in the assembly, and protest in our name against all acts that involve or approve abolition, end quote. And returning to one of Katie Geneva Cannon's searing questions asking what kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to black persons, the most obvious answer is the wrong kind of Christianity. In 1845, Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved black man who escaped his enslaver in Maryland, differentiated between genuine Christianity and the, quote, corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land, end quote, in his autobiographical narrative. In the years following his autobiography, Douglass emerged as one of the most prominent abolitionists, intellectuals, and social reformers of the 19th century. Like Douglass, we too are, quote, filled with unutterable loathing, end quote, when we confront the history of slavery, anti-black racism, and Presbyterianism in the United States. Nearly 20 years after John Rankin published his letters on the immoralities of slavery and anti-black racism, Douglass wrote that the, quote, horrible inconsistencies, end quote, among white Christians continued. Some white congregations, including in their membership, enslavers who physically abused and sexually violated enslaved persons. White Christians upholding marriage and family as divine blessings denied millions of enslaved persons these basic human rights, with the absence of laws protecting enslaved marriages and families from separation in auctions, sales, and transfers. Douglass asserted, quote, the warm defender of the sacredness of the family relation is the same that scatters whole families, sundering husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers, leaving the hut vacant and the heart desolate, end quote. In the same year of Douglass's autobiography, a journal published by the Associate Reformed Synod of the West lambasted Columbia Theological Seminary for benefiting from a public auction of enslaved persons. The journal found it tragic to see human beings listed as property, akin to animals, lands, and other capital in a local Savannah newspaper. But it was especially infuriated to behold a Presbyterian seminary in the listing as the recipient of the funds derived from the sale. The journal criticized the lack of shame or remorse from the seminary as, in their words, scandalous. While the wrong kind of Christianity is the most obvious answer to Cannon's question, this book maintains that a more historically precise and honest answer is the Presbyterian kind of Christianity. White Presbyterians actively participated in the enslavement of black persons and the perpetuation of anti-black racism. Individual members and congregations owned enslaved persons. All these Presbyterians unjustly profited off the uncompensated labor of enslaved persons. Some of these Presbyterians, including ministers, are guilty of committing acts of physical, psychological, sexual, and spiritual abuse against enslaved persons. Elizabeth Keckley, a formerly enslaved black woman with a successful career as an artisan, including a stint working in the White House as a seamstress for First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, recounted the cruel oppression she experienced from a family of Presbyterian enslavers. Keckley received her first beating at the age of 4, and it was a lashing so severe that she never forgot the incident. Even more painful was when Keckley's father was separated from her and her mother to migrate westward with another enslaver. Quote, I can remember the scene as if it were but yesterday, how my father cried out against the cruel separation, his last kiss, his wild straining of my mother to his bosom, the solemn prayer to heaven, the tears and sobs, the fearful anguish of broken hearts, end quote. At the age of 14, Keckley was separated from her mother to live with her enslaver's son, a white Presbyterian minister named Robert Burwell in Virginia. 4 years later, in approximately 1835, Keckley moved with Burwell to Hillsborough, North Carolina, and experienced physical abuse at the hands of both Burwell and a white school principal who was a member of Burwell's congregation. At the behest of Burwell's wife, who sought to subdue what she regarded as Keckley's haughty spirit, Burwell and the school principal whipped Keckley on multiple occasions. The school principal also forcibly stripped Keckley naked. Shortly thereafter, Keckley was raped by another white man, Alexander Kirkland, resulting in her pregnancy and the birth of a child. I believe it is incorrect to present Presbyterians as divided over slavery, such that we imagine in our minds today a grand drama with righteous abolitionists incrementally persuading enslavers and enablers of slavery to join their cause in hallowed Presbyterian buildings all across the nation. A more accurate representation is what Angelina Emily Grimke experienced in her short time as a Presbyterian in Charleston, South Carolina. After leaving her family's Episcopal church in protest of its religious teachings, Grimke joined the local Presbyterian congregation for a minute. She initially relished the church's ministry, experiencing growth in her faith and spirituality, but with this growth came stronger convictions that slavery was irreconcilable with Christianity. Grimke shared these concerns first with the pastor, who told her that he agreed with her, but the most faithful response was to, quote, pray and wait, end quote. Dissatisfied with the pastor's counsel, Grimke approached the church's session. These ruling elders, all of whom were enslavers, noted Grimke's young age and also encouraged her to wait. But the session also disagreed with Grimke and told her that she would learn to see the wisdom of slavery as she matured out of her childish naivete into adulthood. Grimke soon thereafter decided to leave the Presbyterian congregation. The pastor and other church members tried to convince Grimke to remain, in no small part because her family was wealthy and among the elite in Charleston. But Grimke simply refused to remain in a pro-slavery congregation. The examples of Presbyterian abolitionists, such as John Rankin and James W.C. Pennington, are sometimes employed to advance the notion that Presbyterianism in the age of slavery is best understood as divided between abolitionists on one side and enslavers on the other side. Pennington escaped his enslaver in Maryland and became the first black student at Yale Divinity School. Pennington attended lectures there for 2 years, but he was not permitted to officially enroll as a student or speak in class. He later served as a pastor in Connecticut and New York, published several books and essays, and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. But Pennington was more influential outside of Presbyterianism than within it. During his years as a Presbyterian minister, Pennington grew frustrated with his denomination for its reluctance to act more decisively to end slavery, and he experienced racial prejudice from white members of his presbytery. Although the abolitionist side, with faithful Presbyterians like Pennington, is certainly worthy of our attention today, I believe the heavy imbalance in how we remember the past leaves us with the wrong impression. These black and white Presbyterian abolitionists were deeply unpopular and received scant support in the larger church. They were not elected to positions of ecclesial authority, and their voices carried little, if no weight, among other white Presbyterians. Archibald Alexander, a white professor at Princeton Seminary, now he was the kind of leader that a lot of Presbyterians listened to and supported. But Alexander endorsed the colonization movement to send free black Americans to Liberia because he felt the discriminatory contempt white Christians held against black people was too insurmountable to overcome. In 1846, Alexander wrote that anti-black racism was wrong and unreasonable, but he did not commit to working toward racial equality. Instead of teaching white Christians to repent of their sins of racial prejudice, Alexander preferred that black Americans, once emancipated, leave the country and find another home on the African continent, where their skin color would not be so despised. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, in the inaugural issue of The Liberator, explained that the aim of his abolitionist newspaper was to, quote, strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population, end quote, adding that he would not apologize for his use of abrasive and accusatory language, which some white Christians, including Presbyterians like Archibald Alexander, found inflammatory and unchristlike. But Garrison deemed it necessary to, quote, be as harsh as truth, end quote, and he hated the kind of Christianity that appealed to gradual abolition, African colonization, and other moderate compromises. Quote, tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hand of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present, end quote. But white Presbyterians would not relent in prioritizing ecclesial unity over black liberation. William Wells Brown, a formerly enslaved black man and one of the most accomplished authors in the 19th century, recalled his encounters with the white pastor of his enslavers' Presbyterian congregation. Brown found that, quote, the whole aim of the pastor's ministry was to please the slaveholders in the church. When they wanted singing, he sung. When they wanted praying, he prayed. When they wanted a story told, he told the story, end quote. Brown concluded that this pastor did not actually teach any Christian theology to the slave-owning church members, but instead, quote, my master taught theology to him, end quote. In 1851, one white abolitionist, John Gregg Fee, who would later found Berea College in Kentucky, warned his fellow Presbyterians that their ongoing participation in slavery would result in the demise and ruin of their Christian witness. Quote, a church that can sanction and fellowship one of the greatest outrages upon humanity, they feel to be worse than no church, a delusion, a den of wolves, where the lambs of the flock are in danger of being devoured, end quote. Unfortunately, too few white Presbyterians then shared Fee's outrage and heeded his counsel, and all Presbyterians today continue to live with the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Yu, for your presentation. Let us thank him for his work again. Well, I am charged with giving a few moments of talkback, and Dr. Yu and I will engage some questions and conversation. But first, thank you, Columbia Seminary and Dr. Loyo, for the invitation to be here with you all today. Historian Joyce Appleby says this: history is power because we live with its residuals, its remnants, its remainders, and its reminders, as quoted by Dr. Yu. I've been known to tell my students all over the country, wherever I have the privilege to teach, that we've lived longer as a nation under the institution of slavery than we have under the experiment of integration. Hence, in order to better understand where we are going as a nation, we have to know from whence we've come, which is a Sankofa Ghanaian concept, that to better understand our future and our present, we have to understand from whence we've come. I've also been known to tell the congregants of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, also quoted in Dr. Yu's book, that our history will either be our landing strip or our launching pad. And so certainly when Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon raises the question, what kind of Christianity is this? And Dr. Yu's answer is the wrong kind of Christianity. To really assess it as being the wrong kind of Christianity, we have to understand and reconcile with the past. Dr. Yu, thank you for this important book. Noted with the idea and the reality that at one point in the institution of slavery, Presbyterians owned, as you quoted in estimates, somewhere between 77 to 80,000 enslaved people, that 1/3 of the ministers in the Southern Church owned slaves, and that 1/2 of Presbyterians owned slaves. In some respects, we cannot escape this reality of slavery in our past. So why this book and this important reality for such a time as this? Intentionally moving forward as a Presbyterian church and in our Presbyterian institutions, including Columbia Seminary, requires that we remember, that we revisit, that we reckon, and that we reconcile with the past. What I appreciate most importantly about your book, Dr. Yu, is that you attempt to engage a more accurate and faithful counting of the role of slavery in the Presbyterian Church, and therefore the United States of America in that sense, and also to situate slavery in this understanding as a root cause of the ongoing anti-Black racism in the Presbyterian Church USA. In my experiences as a pastor, coming from different faith traditions, Baptist and Pentecostal, I did not grow up Presbyterian. So my arrival here at Columbia Seminary in the fall of 2013 began with this question: if I'm saying yes to God, how do I situate my yes within the historical narrative? And so I ran over to the library and found Gayrard Wilmore's book, Black and Presbyterian. And from that time till this time, I've been reconciling with what it means to inherit a mantle of African-American prophetic witness, both in my pastoral theology and in my preaching, in light of an institution, a Black church birth in the institution of slavery. So your book is important in the sense that it reminds us of the complicity of white Presbyterians in the institution of slavery. This quest to engage an accurate and more faithful accounting of slavery and anti-Black racism requires that we dismantle some untruths about the history of slavery. You point out that the biblical justification of slavery does not sit well in understanding Christ's teaching to be a church founded on justice and love. And at the same token, you challenge the interpretation of slavery as being divisive for the church, which requires a different kind of interpretation. The truth of the matter is, Dr. Yu, is that you put front and center the role that white Presbyterians in both the North and the South have played in supporting actively and complicitly systems of racism, and slavery being one of them, Jim Crow segregation being another, and the lack of hospitality at different points along the history of our church. And so your book challenged us and reminds us that this is a history with which we must wrestle. You also quoted pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, Henry Highland Garnett, who was the first African-American man to sit on the floor of Congress, and he said that slavery can be defined as snatching man away from the high place to which he was lifted by the hand of God and dragging him down to the level of creation. And so in this talk back, I challenge us all to remember the importance of what Dr. Yu has put front and center. It is not just a history for a particular place in a particular time, but it is a history that requires that we grapple with and reconcile what slavery has meant in our institutional past and what it means in our current present. When you know better, you do better. When you know better, you do better. How can we, as the Presbyterian Church, the Church of Christ beyond denominations, move into living and being the justice of God on earth? I also posit that any discussion of anti-Black racism in the Presbyterian Church USA and other reform bodies for that matter in the broader United States and global Christianity requires that we better understand the ways in which historical moments continue to replicate in other systems that continue to set the foundation and framework for racism in its varied forms. So I see your study not only as a historical moment in raising the ways in which slavery has contributed to anti-Black racism in the Presbyterian Church in the broader US. And although we end questioning what immediate emancipation or graduate emancipation or into slavery, disunion, ultimately reunion. Although your narrative situates itself before Reconstruction begins, it does raise the question of what do we do and where do we go and how do we understand the backward look into history and how it's shaping our forward moving progress, both as Presbyterians and in Presbyterian institutions. So I have a question for you as we engage our talk back. And the first is recognizing that this book is designed to interpret a particular historical moment. In my graduate training at the University of Illinois, my colleagues always said, history for history's sake, leave history within this particular time period. But history has much to tell us about how we can continue to live and be the community that God has called us to be. In light of that, we are currently not out of this pandemic called COVID-19. We've lived in a multiplicity of pandemics. I remember walking from 15th Street Presbyterian Church to the White House as we renamed the street outside of the White House as Black Lives Matter Plaza. And I imagine that the questions you raised in your book are questions that happened before the pandemic. But I do want to ask, how has the multiplicity of pandemics, the pandemic of race, the pandemic of COVID, the pandemics of injustice? African American scholars argue that the fight for African American equality did not begin in any one historical epoch, meaning then that what happened in the institution of slavery all the way up to Black Lives Matter continues to shape how we look at the narrative of American history. So my question is, how has the multiplicity of pandemics and evolving US social context, you fill in the gaps, shape your approach to studying African American history, the history of slavery, and most importantly, anti-Black racism in our evolving church?
Oh, thank you, Dr. Perello. It really is a privilege and an honor to be sitting with you and to be doing this together. I have great admiration for your work as both a historian, clergy leader, and theological educator. Now all three, if not more. I did not set out to write an anti-racist book. I did not set out to write a fearless or courageous book. Really, I am trained as a historian, and I prayed, hoped, desired, and set out to write a book that would do three things. One, be as honest as I could be. Two, be as clear as I could be. And three, be as deep as I could be about the history. Honesty, clarity, depth. Yeah. That was what I was after. And I think certainly the book was birthed or kind of moving forward before the COVID-19 pandemic. So initially, if I can be honest with everyone, the first thing that the pandemic did was personally, it just really stressed me out. And it delayed the book because, we all remember watching our former president do all those press conferences with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. And we remember my kids were at home. We didn't know what was happening. And I was, how am I gonna finish this book? We have a deadline here. So at first it did push it back some and it stressed me out. But really it did help me think and clarify and focus on, we have this real huge problem in this country, this powerful, pervasive, wicked, seemingly unrelenting problem of anti-Black racism. And what was the church's role and part and responsibility in this? So then that became the pursuit. And initially I thought I would be able to tell the whole story. That was the goal. But really, I found myself dissatisfied, and I think that's part of how good history works, with the existing historical treatments. And now as the kids might say, I'm throwing a little bit of shade on predecessor historians. But the ways in which slavery was treated as one or two chapters out of several. And it really did isolate the biblical and theological disagreements. And it really came almost entirely from the perspective of the white male clergy and theologians who are on both sides, really, and it's not both sides, most on 90% on one, 10% on the other. So then I thought, really, what were Black Presbyterians experiencing? How were they interpreting the past? And then I think what really helped unlock things for me was, what were enslaved persons who were owned, as unjust and as how perverse as that sounds, but literally legally owned by white enslavers, including Presbyterian enslavers. What were their experiences, such as William Wells Brown and Elizabeth Keckley? And that, Dr. Prelo, really kind of opened up the ways in which slavery was so central to not only this nation's founding first 50, 60 years after the American Revolution, but central to understanding not just anti-Black racism, but I do think what it meant to be Presbyterian in the United States. And so that's where it kind of led. So in the end, providentially ended up being very grateful to have all that extra time. Somewhat stressful between me and the editors, and when you're gonna turn it in and all of that. But.
I certainly think that there's a sentiment that history does repeat itself. And so we think about a longue durée history and legacy of anti-Black racism. Context does matter, but so does an unreconciled past that continues to show up. And so my question does reflect the sense that to be writing your book in a time that Black Lives Matter is happening all over the country does matter in a sense. So thank you for grappling with the question. My next question relates to, although the book in many ways situates yourself at the end of slavery and raise the question of, it doesn't really answer, like you said, the whole entirety of history, but it does in many respects forecast forward. So I want to ask, what charge does your historical research on history of slavery, anti-Black racism offer Presbyterians and Presbyterian institutions that are still grappling and struggling and trying to find their way in the work of racial justice?
Oh yeah, thank you, Dr. Prelo. I think, like you wisely asserted, when we know better, we can do better. I do think that there is a good legacy and witness of Black and white Presbyterian abolitionists that we can affirm, that we can celebrate, that we can learn from, lift up, and even imitate in our ministry today. Such as James W.C. Pennington, Theodore S. Wright, the first Black graduate of Princeton Seminary, class of 1828, John Rankin, and just his bravery and courage. But I do think what happens is it's not as helpful if we were to receive partial or sanitized legacies, memories, remembrances of them. So it is at one level we want to honor, Frederick Douglass too, we want to honor their goodness, but we don't want to confront the evil that made them so good. Or even we don't want to confront why they were so brave. It's like we want the courage, but we don't want their anger and their disappointment. For example, William Wells Brown, his anger and disappointment in white Presbyterianism. We don't want that part. We want the story of how he escaped as enslaver and became one of the most accomplished authors. But to me, I thought of it, it's like celebrating Easter weekend without Good Friday. That's like kind of what that kind of history, and that's kind of what it's been for too long. So I do hope, in like honoring, like Black Presbyterian witness, it is really amazing. I do think we all know, all non-Black Presbyterians, we know too little about Black Presbyterianism. From Pennington to Dr. Cannon to Gaylord Wilmore, who you cited, I love what he says. I'm a Black Presbyterian, so I am ambivalent. Not ambiguous, but ambivalent about being a Black Presbyterian. Because ambiguous implies uncertainty. I don't know, but ambivalent, it's actually clear. This is what I love about Presbyterianism, and this is what challenges me about it. So I do think that kind of ambivalence that Black Presbyterians have had for hundreds and hundreds of years, perhaps more of us could have that kind of ambivalence as well. Like to build those muscles to say, here's what I love about the Reformed tradition. Here's what I love about Presbyterianism. I'm a third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation Presbyterianism. Here's the people of faith that formed me, and I'm super grateful for them, and I love them, and I love being Presbyterian. But at the same time, like you were saying, I want to know better. And so I want to confront the ugliness. I want to confront the fact that much of our wealth, much of our growth, much of our success in the first half of the 19th century is inextricably intertwined with slavery. So I would ask you, Dr. Prelo, like in your study of history and approaching this history that is simultaneously infuriating as it is inspiring, what do you find most helpful about Presbyterian history?
Well, in particular about this Presbyterian history, what I find illuminating and helpful was one of the comments that you just made, that the growth of Presbyterianism coincided with the growth of slavery. And that's a narrative conversation that we don't hear about very often. In the same token, it's refreshing to see more intentional interest in the history of slavery and African American Presbyterians in light of the larger Presbyterian narrative. I do agree and concur that Presbyterians know too little about the history of African American Presbyterians, and we often don't sit with the history of slavery through the lens of Presbyterian-owned institutions. And so it is illuminating in the sense that it is confronting our intentional lack of witness around slavery and anti-Black racism. I also think that it is intentional in that it affords us the opportunity to have conversation. So before I usually accept an invitation to go someplace and teach or speak on the history of African American Presbyterianism, I'll usually send a book list, because I am exhausted from playing this role around the denomination and across the country and teaching about the prophetic witness of African American Presbyterians. There's much to be written on it. And so one of the challenges I think exists both in the archive and in the interpretation of telling African American stories through the Presbyterian lens and engaging Presbyterian history through the lens of the race are what are the sources that we are looking at to tell the story. And this is not a challenge atypical of any narrative on slavery. And as much as this is an important work, it is an important work in the sense that a lot of the voices that you have lifted up are the talkbacks, are the speeches, the archival record of complicit white Presbyterians. But if we roll back the narrative and center the African American woman who was raped by her white Presbyterian master, then how does that challenge our interpretation of slavery? So I think understanding and sitting with white complicity is very important, but as we're reading through the book or grappling with any narrative of slavery, we have to understand that these were African Americans who were enslaved, and they were embodied beings who also had a response. What I also appreciate and find illuminating in your history is that you illuminated the role of the anti-slavery movement and certainly Black and white abolitionists, because we talk about being a connectional church, and it's important to lift up what it means to be connectional, not just in per capita, but what it means to be connectional in terms of participating in movements for racial justice. And today, when we look at what it means to become a beloved church, we almost don't have a pathway to how to do that work. We'll do a strategic plan, we'll assess the institutional climate, but sometimes we have to look to the past to raise the question of how other Presbyterians engaged in intercultural movements for racial justice and the like. But bearing that, African Americans had their own complicity in this experience of becoming Black and Presbyterian. Many of them chose to be Presbyterian even after they were freed. Many of us generations down the road, like myself, heard the Holy Spirit calling and said, "Here I am, Lord, send me." But even in that, the story has to acknowledge that there is a longue durée witness of African American Presbyterians. And as Du Bois talked about being both African and American and wrestling with that, I'll speak for myself. As a Black woman who's also Presbyterian, I wrestle with that. And so I think it's important to lift up that African Americans have, in addition to those you named, but beyond just the pro-slavery argument and the anti-slavery argument and the role of abolitionists, but to lift up the long durée history. And we name people like Gabriel Wilmore, Katie Geneva Cannon, but there are people who are in the trenches who are building a history and witness and legacy of what it means to be Black and Presbyterian in the United States. And I remember most specifically the small rural church that I pastored in Winsboro, South Carolina. Wherever there was a school, there was a church, and that is typical of the Presbyterian witness. But in that, understanding that many African Americans had the option. They had the option to be a part of other Black faith traditions, but they intentionally chose to live out their call to serve God in an expression of Presbyterianism. So I think your book provides an avenue into how we better understand the complexity of being a person of color in the Presbyterian Church USA. And I'm not speaking for all African Americans, but speaking for myself, there's a charge to doing that, to inhabiting being a Black woman in predominantly white ecclesial spaces. It is both is a sacred burden at times, but it's a work nonetheless. Yeah. Thank you.
So I will share, I think, so one thing that, one is that I do think the presence of these courageous Black Presbyterian ministers and abolitionists and white colleagues
Right.
who participated also, like there's another Elijah Lovejoy who founded an abolitionist newspaper in Missouri, Illinois, and actually was martyred and killed by a white pro-slavery mob in Alton, Illinois in 1837. So I think, though, it is wonderful, but I think for the longest time in historical memory, they've been used to kind of say, look, no, not just the bad stuff, but the good stuff too. You have to look at the whole picture. So then for me, I looked at the whole picture and I saw, again, like I shared, how unpopular, how reviled these white abolitionists and Black abolitionists were. How much of a nuisance and an annoyance they were in the larger Presbyterian church. So much so that I benefit from Albert Barnes. He was a pastor of First Presbyterian in Philadelphia, PA, for decades. And he wrote 2 books, one in 57, and he's 1857. And he did say, like, you know, for the Presbyterian church to be able to say nothing about slavery, it actually takes, like, intricate, fine ecclesiastical maneuvering. It is the hardest thing in the world to figure out how to maneuver, how to use parliamentary procedure, how to get congregations, how to do this, how to keep the abolitionists silent, how to make sure they're not elected as commissioners. All of this work, it actually takes a lot of work for a tradition and denomination to pretend to say nothing. And then he also said, things are so bad, and this is by 1857, before the run of the Civil War, he said things are so bad in our denomination or in our tradition Christian community that, like, the enslavers are honored. Again, some of them elected moderator of General Assemblies, pastors of the largest, wealthiest Presbyterian churches. Benjamin Morgan Palmer, who taught at Columbia Seminary, first elected moderator in 1861 of the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America. Just vile white supremacist and vile anti-Black racist. He was the pastor of one of the largest churches in New Orleans, Louisiana. I think he was one of the most, I think I can find the receipts, but he was one of the wealthiest paid pastors in the United States on the eve of the Civil War. And so it's like that's who was honored. And Rankin and Theodore Wright and Pennington, these were the people who were ignored and nuisances. So it's actually, when you look at the whole picture, it's not like a 50-50 thing.
Right.
Actually, the presence of the abolitionists does more to criticize and damn Presbyterianism than it does to defend it. Harriet Martineau, and I'll close with this, she was an English sociologist, kind of pioneering woman in the academy in England. She visited the States several times. She wrote in the 1830s, 1840s. And she said, you know, Presbyterians, it is the most noble of abolitionists are Presbyterian, and the most vile of enslavers and enablers of slavery are Presbyterian. Both are true. And so, what does that mean, though? Again, that doesn't mean like we leave feeling good. It means who was honored, right? And yeah,
Before we
I'm rambling.
shift, thank you for your comment. Before we shift to get a few questions from the audience, I want to ask you a question about sources and understanding the context and understanding the context of slavery. How might your study be expanded if you were able to include the voices, not only of abolitionists, who for the most part could read and write for the most part, but of enslaved African-American Presbyterians? What do you think their embodied experience would mean in light of your interpretation?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Dr. Perillo. I'll answer briefly and ask you the same. So I think we all have to grapple with the truths and the perspectives that we see in the autobiographies of formerly enslaved Black persons. Frederick Douglass noted, and he was a genius, but Riley, he said, one of my enslavers went to a Methodist camp meeting and got converted, and he became more cruel and more wicked because he felt he had God's justification to own me and other enslaved persons. In some ways, some enslaved persons, I think several things. Some we see in the narratives that they were able to recognize, like Douglass and others, that Christianity is different from the wicked practices of hypocrites who were professing Christ. But I think we also have to wrestle with, it's clear to me at least that some enslaved persons and other white persons living in that era, they really thought all of it is bad. Christianity is an utterly unworthy religion. And we have to wrestle with that, and we cannot sanitize that. That the wicked practices and the hypocrisy spoke more clearly and loudly than, unfortunately, some of the Black and white Presbyterian leaders who we really affirm. What do you think in terms of getting at the embodied
I
lived?
raised a question because on one side, when we situate white complicity in developing the institution of slavery, and we talk about slavery as something happened to and on enslaved people, we sometimes minimize, not in your book necessarily, but we minimize the voice and agency of enslaved people, and even the choice after emancipation to remain Presbyterian is a choice of agency, right? To further develop, build, sustain African American, not only churches, but other educational institutions like Lucy Craft Laney, who founded the first school for African American in Augusta, Georgia, and her dad was a Presbyterian minister. So all that to say, even from the Middle Passage on through Civil War and the present, African Americans have had an intentional response against the complicity of whiteness in the context of slavery. So I look forward to more studies that situate not only the complicity and, to be fully transparent, even the complicity of Blacks who owned slaves. And I have yet to read a narrative on Black Presbyterians who owned enslaved people, but that is part of the narrative as well. But just to say that, to situate the agency of enslaved people in this broader narrative. And that agency, as I've said a few times already, is even to grow into a prophetic Presbyterian witness in and of itself. And even agency to continue to remain in a denomination and do the work of racial justice. So let's take a moment to thank Dr. Yu for his comments so far.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk back. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I told Dr. Yu that wherever he travels on the road, let me know, and I'd be welcome to be a conversation partner. Do we have any questions from the audience? And if you can raise your hand, we have a mic. I see Dr. Marcia Riggs. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for the book. Having known you as a colleague here on the faculty, one of the things you do in this book, though, is also indict Columbia Theological Seminary.
It is.
So, as a faculty member, I mean, the concluding paragraph in itself kind of blows us out of the water, okay?
Right. Yes, thank you.
So I want to know, as a faculty member, as director of the MDiv program, what would you hope your history can also teach us about becoming a better or a different theological educational institution?
That's good.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Riggs. I think you've got some answers to your question. So maybe I'll go first, Britt, and then you can. I do. I find Columbia Seminary as a educational institution, it is appalling. I share in that paragraph just so there are many defenses of slavery and perpetuation of anti-Black racism, some on economic terms.
Right.
Some of the challenge around why it was so difficult for some to wrap their head and their minds around abolition, really unjust. But it was less about the Bible, and I'm just going to be honest, it was the reality that 3 things were required in the antebellum United States to be a successful business person: land, labor, and capital. And enslaved persons provided 2 of those 3. They were both labor and capital. Their children were additional capital that an enslaver owned. It was just an enormous source of revenue and wealth that it was hard to imagine what a world without it, for some, would be like. Again, not all, and I don't mean to justify it. Like, many people were like, yes, this is going to be hard for us to untangle economically, but look, 4 million enslaved persons in 1860, this has got to stop, even if it requires separation, succession, and war. But some white Presbyterians, including some said no. And what I found appalling is they said, no, we're not economists. We're not going to do that argument. We're not sociologists. We're not even kind of scientists. We think slavery is right because that's what the Bible teaches. And that's what God says. And that is utterly disgusting and depraved, right? To say my argument is right, not because I'm the smartest economist, but because God said so. Because I know how to interpret God's word. So with that, I do think one is, I hope that it creates, or it continues to encourage Columbia Seminary to have simultaneously a spirit of humility and boldness. That humility to know that we are human interpreters of the divine and where we need accountability, so that it's a collaborative effort, so that we're recognizing it's in our PCUSA Book of Order. We're sensitive to idolatry and tyranny and the human attractiveness to that. So that's why we need to work together to make sure that doesn't happen. But also the boldness to say, this was wrong. This was never confessed. This was never repaired. For example, I do honestly hope that Columbia Seminary would seriously think about Black reparations, not only in the form of scholarships and programs, but also in the form of seeking to find all of the descendants of enslaved persons that Columbia Seminary either owned, benefited from, were connected to, and to offer financial compensation. Columbia Seminaries, for example, Dr. Riggs, you can tell I've thought about this. At the end of 2021, Columbia Seminary endowment in terms of investment was $284 million. I recognize that's taken a little bit of hit. I think we all kind of know that when we look at our own stuff too, right? But let's say it's at $250 million. I do wonder, 2%, $5 million. What would it be like to say, we're going to do our best effort. We may not find all of the descendants, but we're going to find as many descendants as we can, and we're going to figure out a fund to pay them. And in some ways, morally, I think that's right. Perhaps that's challenging to us because institutionally, that's not money Columbia Seminary gets back. Scholarships, programs, centers, which one of our sibling seminaries, Princeton Seminary, has done, all those things are part repair, but I'm going to be honest with y'all, it's part investment. It's part to actually help the institutional mission grow. Whereas something like this, Virginia Theological Seminary, they've done something like this. They found all the descendants of employees that were enslaved or were paid less during Jim Crow segregation, and they're using their endowment to pay the families. First payments went out this summer. I think in one way, it's morally right, and it's somewhat bold of an institution, because that money has no institutional missional value outside of being the moral right thing to do. That's not money a seminary like Columbia ever gets back, right? A scholarship, you get it back. You've got alumni who can share the good news about Columbia with other students. And I don't mean this in a kind of sarcastic or bitter way, but I do think institutions such as ours are less willing to do the reparation for descendants
Exactly.
because you don't get that money back. But I hope we do, Dr. Riggs. What do you think? You think we should do something like that?
Well, I actually want to ask you the question a little differently. I don't know if I
Okay.
can do this. I want to go at it practically.
Okay.
And like I said, you're director of the MDiv program. Curriculum revision. What does it mean, or could it mean, to have history drive the curriculum rather than the Bible and theology drive the curriculum?
Oh, I don't know. I think one is I hope it is the recognition, and I think I'm grateful to all of my colleagues in the classes I teach now. They've shared about how, because one of them is the MDiv introductory seminar online, so they share in forums about how some of their other classes have helped them. And the one thing it is to note that there is no ahistorical or non-historical interpretation of Bible and theology. That every person who opens the Bible to read it, they're praying certainly for the illumination of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
But they're also in their own context, with their own motivations. Again, it's the humility to recognize that some of the economic, financial, social, cultural, even religious comforts and motivations and desires, that these things are also being infused into how we interpret the scripture theology, how we preach, how we lead worship, and the like. So I do think that historical grounding and also good contextual understanding of who I am, the church that I lead, the community of faith that I came from. I hope that these things can be helpful for us in having an entire curriculum like a lot of us on the faculty are doing in our classes.
So in other words, when you know better, you do better. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Yu. So having been a student of yours, I'm thinking about what does your book look like in a MDiv class? By that I mean, what do you hope your students walk away with history like this being presented to them?
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon. That's really a good question, and I think you can share some from the classes we were in together. And you teach U.S. history at Decatur High School, so you are in a similar context. I think, so one thing different, Brandon, perhaps about our context is, so I think in the seminary or the congregational context, so much of church history is imbalanced toward a search for inspiration. Yeah, and it's not bad for Christian history to be a search for heroes. Who can we imitate? Who can we follow? That's like a good part of church history, but it's incomplete. I think it is also to understand, in the same way perhaps at Columbia Seminary, and I think you're doing this at the high school, Decatur High School, it's we are trying to really get at the church as it really is, right? So history is the church as it really was, even again with the recognition that there is going to be some ambivalence. And I think, like Dr. Prelo was saying, and we've talked about this too, it's this sense of, for example, for Presbyterians of color, there is a sense of, and there is an internal, sometimes external with others, wrestling with, I'm going to be a member, I'm going to be a leader in this denomination that is also was known as the white man's religion, quote unquote, or the enslaver's religion, or the slave-owning religion. And so I'm going to grapple with that, because I think there's a lot of beauty and wonder, for example, whether it's in the Christian tradition, the Reformed tradition, and I'm going to weigh it all out with some of the ugliness and the reality. I think that's what a lot of Christians on the margins, marginalized, racialized, racism, that's what they are doing. And so there's that kind of muscle built in. There's that testimony. That's why I can preach so boldly and confidently and honestly. And I know, Brandon, you do this in your church, and we can talk some about, in your classroom, I think it's the ideals of American history with the realities of American history and some of the fragility around that. So it is this thing that actually is not that fragile among Christian leaders of color, Presbyterian leaders of color. We've been doing this our whole lives. We've been doing this since we accepted the call. I'm going to be a Presbyterian because and despite. But I do think some of our white colleagues don't have that muscle. Or it's not as developed, so that when you encounter some of the ugly parts of Presbyterian history, it's like, whoa, 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 I don't want that. Or or so much of it is actually blamed on or attributed to biblical literalism. So the problem really was they read the Bible too literally.
Right.
Or some parts of the
It's more
Reformed
complicated.
theology that are like pessimistic about human depravity. When in fact, I think on Reformed theology actually is, when you get to the historic faith, historic, by the way, it's 10 times in the PCUSA Book of Order, including the appendices. It actually is a history of social reform and civic participation.
Within it.
And actually, the reason why it's not that, I think, is actually because of trying to finagle and figure out a way around supporting and upholding slavery and keeping slave-owning members in the ecclesial body.
Thank you, thank you. So thank you all for attending, and at this point, we are going to welcome Nancy to come forward at this time.
Hello? Am I on the microphone? Yes. Okay, thank you. I want to introduce Kelly Campbell, who's the head of the library here at Columbia. She is going to share some information about the reception that is about to commence after the book talk. There will be some opportunities to talk with William and Presavia and some of the rest of us. And most importantly, if you do not yet have a copy of the book, we do have copies of the book. So Kelly, please.
So thank you. I just wanted to take a moment and say that I think the book talk and then the following reception when we're going to fellowship together is just an example of the vital partnership between PHS and the C. Benton Klein Jr. Special Collections and Archives. We work together regularly. We answer reference questions. We digitize Presbyterian materials, and we try to preserve the Presbyterian history with its good and bad and ugly that's there. While you may not be aware of it, PHS is the official repository for the denomination, but here in the third floor of the archives and the library, we have over 5,000 church history and records. And the archive staff has pulled some of those for you in an exhibit on the third floor where you can see enslaved names from enslaved congregations while you're at the reception this afternoon. We also have Presbyterian women's histories from across the United States, and we have over 6,000 of those. So sometimes you see the church records where it says the church did this, but then you'll see the women who had been working for that for a while before that happened. So you really get a whole history of happening. We also want to just say a public acknowledgement and appreciation for PHS staff. For Nancy Taylor, we've worked together collaboratively with her, with Lucy Duckinson-Brimble, who's here. We got to meet her, who's their development person, Natalie Shilstead, and David Stanionos, some other people that we work with at there. So as you leave tonight, the library is located on the north side. You can exit this building 2 different directions. There'll be people to guide you to the library, to the reading room, where they have the reception set up, which is hosted and funded by PHS. I'm going to take William with me. so that we can move to the other building. I'm afraid we'll get stopped with conversations. He will be at the table where you can have a signed copy of the book, and then he'll be around for the reception as well. So we want to thank you again for coming. We're going to kind of transition into the reception area, and let's go ahead and give them another round of applause.
Let me get a picture before you go. Let me get a picture. Let me get a picture before you go.